The Ufology World Congress. Barcelona, Hotel Catalonia, Barcelona Plaza, 9, 10 y 11 de septiembre de 2022. El Congreso de Investigación UFO más importante de Europa. Transmisión en vivo para todo el mundo. Por primera vez en la historia en el campo de la investigación del fenómeno, Christopher Mellon, exdirector del Comité de Inteligencia de los Estados Unidos, realizará su primera presentación en vivo para un congreso de ufología.
Trabajó para las agencias de inteligencia de Estados Unidos durante unos 20 años en varios puestos, incluido el subsecretario de Defensa para Inteligencia. Estamos cercanos de admitir la existencia de seres de otros mundos en nuestro planeta.
So in an article you recently published, you mentioned that it was possible and it is of a great interest to for the state, some of the state functionaries, that it was of a big interest to retrieve UAP object that has crashed, and that this UAP used inverse technology. Do you think that this inverse technology was really in the object, and is this the main interest of retrieving the item?
Okay, thank you for the question. Obviously, that's a topic everybody's excited about, right? Let me say a couple things at the outset. First of all, I need everybody to understand that I'm only speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for the Galileo Project, which I work with. I'm not speaking for the Scientific Coalition of Ufology. I'm not speaking for any of the government organizations that I sometimes work with. It's purely my own views. If I understand your question correctly, in my article, what I said was that Congress is putting in place a procedure, our government, that will grant amnesty to people that have information about that topic. There have been long-standing allegations that our government has recovered some crashed alien material. And so our government, the great exciting thing is that we should get to the bottom of that soon, because there's going to be a legal mechanism by which government officials, military people, and others who may be laboring under legal restrictions will actually be able to come forward without fear of arrest or prosecution to talk about that or other programs that have not been briefed to Congress or released to the American people or the public. So,
Señor Mellon, ¿usted cree que el Pentágono tiene acceso a información que podría ser de interés general para que se sepa?
There are people that make that claim, and there are people that the Congress is putting this procedure in place because they have reason to believe that that may in fact be the case. As hard as that is to believe, as mind-boggling as that is to believe, they didn't do this on a whim, right? This is an extraordinary thing to get members of Congress to embrace such a radical notion, right? There's been incredible change in the last few years on Capitol Hill. When I got involved in this issue in 2017, there had essentially been no change publicly since 1970 and the end of Project Blue Book. We were stuck in a do loop, and there were allegations and nothing was changing. There was no progress, no resolution. So the really great, exciting news today is that, one, the Congress is engaged. They're putting this legislation in place. It hasn't passed, but it is in bills in both houses of Congress. In the committee bills going to the floor, it's almost certain to pass. Meanwhile, the military and the Defense Department have been directed and are embracing the mission to begin using the vast apparatus of the Defense Department for the first time ever to try to seek answers to this question. And I've written about those capabilities. I've written some things on my website that at a public unclassified level give the public some sense, some notion of how incredible some of these capabilities are. If you don't know what the space fence is, if you don't know what our ballistic missile defense system is and the power, we have systems that can see a tennis ball 20,000 miles away in orbit. Right. So now those incredible capabilities are being used to begin to try to answer this question. So that's the really exciting thing. If I could follow up, I think this will be of general interest. If I could follow on to that briefly. There are people that I know, I've been working this for many years now, and interacting with many people in the Defense Department, political people, senators, former secretaries of defense, scientists, generals. There are some people who are trustworthy, who have the appropriate credentials and access, who have told me that this is true, and have told me that they are going to, or they're considering coming forward once this legislation's passed. But I want to also add something else, and this is important because the UFO community doesn't generally hear the other side of the story. And that is, for every one of those people, there are also another probably 4 or 5 or 10 people that are very, very senior who told me it's not true, right? Former secretaries of defense, Air Force generals, and others. So I think we all need to be patient and give the system a chance to work. And it should. I believe it will.
Dice que he would like to ask a question more related to personal beliefs, and he would like to know what can you say about the statement that UFOs do not have propulsion systems, and what do you think this can involve?
The statement that UFOs do not have propulsion systems?
Yes.
Propulsion systems.
Don't have what?
Visible.
There's no propellers, no...
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I understand the question. There are, mountains of evidence of the Nimitz case, for example. We have seen and photographed and tracked vehicles for decades that have no exhaust, they have no air intake, they have no control surfaces, they have no visible means of propulsion, they have no wings. I mean, this is one of the interesting things about this phenomenon to me, is that if we imagine whether probes from some other civilization might be visiting our planet, we would expect them to be so radically different that they would appear to be like magic, right? And that's kind of what we see. So yes, we absolutely do see objects that are doing things we don't understand and can't explain. There's no question about that. No question.
Thank you. The first 2 questions were addressing the July 2022, when Representative Mike Gallagher, Republican congressman from Wisconsin's 8th District, introduced that amendment that would go to the fiscal year 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, and that it could give or would give government employers and contractors immunity from reprisal, this is quotes, for coming forward about UFO encounters and programs. And what I'm wondering is, this is now the end of the first week in September, and I think if this is going to be enacted, it would have to be in this October, in the next month, and wondered if you could give us some update on what happens in October, and if it doesn't pass, what would transpire.
So the legislation funds the U.S. military. So there is a strong incentive to get it passed every year. It's kind of a, that the funding has to continue somehow. But it's also a bill that has so many billions of dollars. It's around $800 billion, and many individual programs and different amendments. That legislation has to pass the House. It has to go to conference with the Senate, has to then be passed in the identical form by both houses and go to the president for signature. Typically what happens is it gets late into the fall, and there are so many amendments being offered to that bill because there's so much money that they can't get it actually passed until they get pressed up against Thanksgiving vacation or Christmas vacation. That's the reality. So probably by the end of the fall, by the end of the year,
Christmas.
Could be by Christmas. It should happen, but sometimes what they do is extraneous forces, sometimes for political reasons, they can't get it done. And what they do then is they have a short-term extension of the current budget. So that's a possibility as well. Most likely it will be enacted by the end of the year or early next year.
Do you think it would have?
So we'll let her translate. Yeah. Let me, if I may add a little bit. There is also legislation in the Senate side. So similar legislation in the Senate. It's almost certain to pass, almost guaranteed to pass, because there is support in both parties in both houses. And it's already in the bills that are going to the floor. So it'll, it could be November, it could be January, but it is almost certain to happen in the months ahead.
Just a quick follow-up.
But let her translate it. Yeah. So there's the language in the Defense Authorization Act, also in the Intelligence Authorization Act. So there is support in the armed services and intelligence committees in both houses of Congress for this. Strong support, and there's no opposition in the Congress to it. So it's almost certain to happen in the months ahead.
So if this whistleblower act passes part of that bill, do you expect people like Elizondo to come forward and blow the whole thing open? And also, what makes you so passionate about this subject?
Okay.
So it's a little two-part.
Okay. One, I can't speak for Lou, but I don't think Lou is going to be one of the people who is going to be coming forward. I don't believe that Lou worked directly on any alien recovery program. Could be wrong, but I don't believe that's the case. I know Lou very well.
Okay.
We work closely together. But there are other people. Why am I passionate about it? Two things. One, I've been interested in this since I was 7 years old. And I saw a video of that had been taken by a member of the community. It was showed to our entire school, of a massive UFO in broad daylight, sailing through the clouds, came in broad, beautiful day, blue sky, and it was sailing along. It came and it banked and it went into a cloud and it disappeared, and then it came out the other side. So I started reading all of the books that I could and all of that, put a hook in me. But the other thing is, and the thing that got me involved publicly, is that in 2017, early 2017, late 2016, I was doing some consulting for the Office of Naval Intelligence, and I met Lou in the Pentagon and some others, and I became aware that our fighter pilots were encountering these things on a regular, weekly, almost daily basis in over training ranges in the ocean, and nobody was doing anything about it. It wasn't being reported to up the chain. The Secretary of Defense didn't know. The Congress didn't know. Everybody was afraid to talk about it. And the fighter pilots were having near mid-air collisions. It was so prevalent. They were putting warning notices at the bases for the fighter pilots, saying, "Be aware that these things are out there, and we're seeing them so often. There's a potential to actually, have a crash." And so when I learned that I just said that's not acceptable. I'm going to do whatever I can, and that's when I really got involved, trying to first get to the Secretary of Defense, then going to the New York Times and the Congress.
Thank you.
One short point I would like to add to that. The report that went to Congress, the unclassified report, last June of 21, identified 11 near mid-air collisions. So there's a safety issue as well as a broader national security issue. Who's flying around our country that, why are they there? Who are they? And what are they doing snooping around our military bases? And then, of course, there's the larger scientific, cosmic questions.
Say who, we could take a guess because that's another question.
Yeah.
Y para terminar, quería añadir que she's asking what geopolitical repercussions can this legislation being passed can have, and what implication does it have if the government of the United States of America recognizes that there is indeed presence of aliens? And she also adds that during Cold War, the trend was to remain silent and to keep everything in secrecy. And now, if this act is passed, she is wondering that if this is recognized, if this sort of information is recognized, what will happen? Is this going to create a new trend for everything to go public and declassified?
Yeah, great question. Two things I need to say about that. First of all, the legislation doesn't ensure that the information will go public. So it will go to Congress, it will go to the Advanced Airborne Reconnaissance Office, the Anomalous Airborne Reconnaissance Office, which is going to be getting a new name after this year's legislation passes. They're changing the name again to the Joint Aerospace Undersea Program Office. But it's important to bear in mind that it will not necessarily become immediately public information. It could still be behind. Congress handles a lot of classified information and keeps a lot of information secret. So they'll have to make a decision at that point in the White House. That's the first point.
El primer punto, el submarino.
I need to respond to the second part of your question. Two things. One, fabulous question. I like to be optimistic. My hope is that if this is true, that the information will become public. The world we live in today, and this is, there are people that are frightened of the extraterrestrial question, but is that more frightening than the fact that we live in a world in which nuclear escalation is increasing, nuclear weapons are proliferating, global warming is happening, artificial intelligence is not under any kind of control, biotechnology is expanding out of control. The consequence is that we need unprecedented collaboration and cooperation of nations all over the world. And I think the most optimistic scenario would be is that this might cause the nations of the world to view one another differently and collaborate in ways they haven't before. So that is, if this goes public and there's no change in behavior, they continue to be these furtive sightings, but everybody realizes, oh my gosh, somebody else is here. We're being watched. We don't know what their agenda is. That could be a level of shock and reframing of how we think about ourselves as a species and our planet that I would like to think it might have a very positive effect in enhancing collaboration and reducing conflict between countries. That would be my hope.
Sí, respondiendo a la segunda parte de...
Primero Sonia.
Hi, Sonia from CodeVivo.com. I've been speaking to some researchers here and they are all kind of wondering what I'm trying to convey here, which is with all the information that has been disclosed recently, have you or any of the people you normally work with, such as you, faced any legal repercussions, or did you have any NDAs regarding that? And on the other hand, we would also like to ask, because you made some statements back in 2016 in an interview with Leslie Keane, where you said that after examining all the DoD's flag programs, you didn't find any convincing evidence that they were kind of occulting any UFO information. But recently, it feels like you've changed that point of view. So what happened? Perhaps you learned something that made you change your mind.
Good questions. So there's first of all, the legal repercussions. It's a very serious and real issue. It's so serious I can't answer your question fully because there are. It's a very real issue for people I know, and I can't get any detail about it. That's how serious it is. Secondly, your other question is that yes, my views have changed. So when I worked in the Defense Department, there's a structure for monitoring all of the black programs to make sure the Army and Navy and Air Force and DARPA, et cetera, are not duplicating, so that the Secretary of Defense has control over all those programs that are spread around. At that time, I participated in the review of those programs, and there was nothing related to UFOs. But there's not enough time to explain how complicated our system is of secrets, but one of the things you have to understand is that we have 3 galaxies of secrets, and I was very deep in 2 of them, but not in the 3rd. We have the intelligence community, which has its own whole world of secrets. We have the Defense Department, which has hundreds of programs that the intelligence community doesn't know about, and largely vice versa. Then we have the Department of Energy, which has tens of billions of dollars of black programs. And there's some intersect. But since I left the government, I have learned new things and new information that have raised a question as to whether there wasn't something outside of that system that was so special, so super secret, that it was kept out of that whole process. And so that's one of the questions. And that's one of the reasons Congress is taking the action that it is.
I don't know the precise figure, but I'm assuming the United States of America is maybe a 10th of the land mass, the non-water land in the world, something like that, maybe 10th. And Russia perhaps is a 5th or something like that. It's much bigger than we are. We can assume that if there have been countless reports and radar detections and encounters, and here and even the recovery of, perhaps, if that's true, of material in the United States, that the same thing has happened all over the world. I think it's hard to imagine that the UFOs are only visiting us. And if they crash, they'll crash wherever they crash. Certainly they've been detected everywhere. I'm sorry, yes, the question is, first of all, is there any benefit politically for the country or is there any loss for the country that first declares that they are studying UFOs? And the second is, besides the United States, Russia, and China, if a country like Peru or Chile, who have been more open, what is keeping them from coming full out and saying this is what we have? Are they influenced by their respective sphere of influence, like the United States or Russia or China?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, please stick to one question each, because we don't have a lot of time left.
So clearly it's a global phenomenon, no question. And we see that in civilian reports from around the world. And Other countries, the French have had an official government office for decades that's been studying the UAP phenomenon. So, and we're obviously very overtly doing it now. The fact that we're open about that, I don't know that that brings much advantage. If your question was simply, is there an advantage to saying, to being the first ones to admit you're studying it?
No, but not that you're studying it, but that you found this.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so, yeah, so one of the things that we don't know is, and first of all, it might not be a crash, right? There are different versions of these stories and different flavors. And one of them is that something was just left like a gift. Something just landed. That's a story. It's not, I'm not saying that's true. That's one version of the story. I think if we imagine for a moment that a country has recovered something like that, the military people, their natural desire is going to be to exploit it for their unique advantage, right? Rather than probably going public with it. But as I said earlier, I think we're at a point where conflict, the trends in international relations are so negative with Russia and the Ukraine and China and the South China Sea and Taiwan, not to mention global warming and so many other things, that something that shocks and jolts the system and our entire species and causes us to think about our planet differently and ourselves might have a tremendous beneficial effect. That would be my hope. And maybe that's because I've been involved in trying to bring this out, so I'm naturally wanting to think this is going to be for the better if that proves to be the case.
We have thousands of reports from abductees and experiencers such as me of not only UFO sightings or ET abductions, but also military abductions reports. So my question to you is, are you aware of any of these programs being taken, actually performed by U.S. Army or officials? Or do you personally believe that they're going to come to this, to the public and reveal this information?
Mm-hmm. Okay, a couple things. One, my role in this, it is so hard to get people in the government to even consider the possibility that UFOs are real, that UAPs are real. I didn't want to go anywhere near the abduction phenomenon. I faced the challenge of senators, congressmen, editors from major newspapers, trying to get them to take that issue seriously. That was a huge challenge to begin with. If we had tried from the outset to include abductions and that sort of thing, I don't know that we'd be where we are today with the progress that we've made. I hope that whatever else is involved in this phenomenon comes to light. And that's a fascinating phenomenon. I have a friend who is a career CIA person who had an incredible experience along the lines of what you're discussing, but it did not involve our military. We have military personnel who've had reported some, on occasion, some amazing, crazy experiences. I have no knowledge or information of our military being involved in trying to any kind of abduction activity. And I'll add, I would be amazed if that proved to be the case, that our military was involved with that kind of thing. I've seen some reports from people who claimed that they were abducted and they got onto a craft and they saw military personnel there. I've heard of that kind of thing, but I've read about that kind of thing, but I have never encountered anybody in the military that has never had any suggestion that, even with the Air Force people, interesting, the Air Force people are still incredulous that this is even a real issue. I mean, they are still extremely resistant to even talking about this or getting involved in any way, shape, or form, much less, just with the generic phenomenon. And so, I don't know anything about that, and I'd be amazed if that was the case. But it's all about the data. Wherever the trail, we just got to follow the trail wherever it goes.
También he says that his question is going to be pretty simple. It has to do with your work in intelligence. And he says that what if the UAP are really weapons sent by Russia or China? And what if the US is making a terrible mistake by showing their weaknesses and acknowledging this?
So, very interesting question. The report to Congress from the Defense Department, the first unclassified report, stated, we see no evidence that any of these are Russian or Chinese. And that's not surprising because they're unidentified, right? They're all unidentified. But they're not seeing any indication that Russia or China has some technology beyond anything that we possess. So when we're seeing things that are, like in the Nimitz case with the Tic Tac there, that was engaged in instantaneous acceleration and extreme altitude, we have no reason to believe that any other country has that kind of technology. Having said that, they also said, and I agree with this as well, that we're seeing a range of phenomenon. So in some cases, we have Navy ships, for example, that are being swarmed by small lights, which could be an advanced drone. And that's probably more likely than an extraterrestrial vehicle, some kind of Chinese secret drone or something, entirely possible. Some of those may be. We have in other countries, any country that's engaged in modern military warfare is confronting a huge new challenge they're not well prepared for when it comes to drones and unmanned vehicles. If you look at the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijanis won that conflict decisively and quickly, largely because of drones they got from Turkey. You can see the role that drones are playing in the Ukraine, in the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. And most conventional defensive systems were geared towards detecting aircraft and missiles, right? So these new, smaller, low radar cross-section out there are a big challenge for our military and other militaries. So I don't think it's exposing any weakness that we were not aware of or that others were not aware of. Mm-hmm. Actually, if I could add one thing, I think the really important thing is if Lou and I hadn't done what we'd done, those things might still be flying around. Now we're starting to look and do something about it to protect our country. That was our first motivation. So I think we're much better off because that information came out. Now we're taking steps to correct it and find out. Before that, we were just pretending that it wasn't happening. So I think we're much better off.
All of this thinks that disclosure is imminent, which implies that the US government or a branch of it already have the answer. What do you think about that? Is it possible? And why do, in that case, Congress spend a lot of money on this right now?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that because there's a misperception, a widespread misperception in the UFO community, which is understandable but mistaken. And that is there are people that think there's some controlling hand and there's some conspiracy and the federal government has got this plan and they're rolling this out and like I'm part of it and other people are puppets in this plan. That's rubbish. Everything that's happened and come to light is because of some activists and troublemakers who have gotten some information and gone to the press, and people in the press who've been willing to work on this, and people in Congress. The government is not got some disclosure plan, and disclosure is not imminent. What you're reading about now in Congress is what's happening. I can tell you that there are senior Pentagon people who do not believe that there's any crashed material, do think that this is all bogus. They think it's rubbish, and much less disclosure. And I'm talking about very, very senior people who have access to a lot of information, and they're saying, in some cases, the people on the Hill, what are you talking about? And, show us the evidence. And, they're mystified still. So the UFO community, of which I'm a part, I guess, but, we have a tendency to see and hear, one side of the story in our own stuff. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories because the government has lied and concealed information and all of those things. The conspiracy theories grow in darkness, right? But to the best of my knowledge, the federal government is not in charge or running. It doesn't have any big plan, and disclosure is not imminent. If it does happen, it'll be the result of the efforts of people in Congress right now, and people are taking action, and small number of people who may have this information if they come forward.
What about that 23-minute film Elizondo's talking about?
Excuse me.
I'd like to add to that just a little bit and say, this is very strange for me because I have a foot in two completely different worlds. And the people in those two different worlds see this issue entirely differently. And they talk right past each other. And I go to meetings with people who have, a salad all over their chest, and, they're running all these secret programs and the Air Force, all this stuff, and they look at me like I'm crazy, like I have a third eye in my head. And I talk to other people who are deep insiders who've had access to classified programs for decades and are very, very credible people who are telling me things that sound very credible that are completely opposed. I think the good news is that hopefully we're going to get the truth and get to the bottom line finally because of what Congress is doing.
Yes.